I am so humbled to be with you all today in this beautiful, beautiful church. If we were speaking in a traditional setting, one of the first things that we would say is, I don't know if there's any words that I may say which will affect your life, but I have asked God to change my life from having been in your presence today. And I have asked God in my prayers that from your spirit and your lives and the work that you do for God in this place where you have made a difference in the lives of so many other people, that this life would be changed from having been with you. And that when I arrive back home on Tuesday and step off the plane, that I will be able to tell my family what work the Holy Spirit of God has brought in my life from having been in the presence of you, who the Holy Spirit works through in your lives. The robe that I'm wearing in many ways is not a traditional robe. It is the history of my family. My grandfather was picked up from a battlefield in the 1890s and wrapped in this, which was a cavalry blanket. He was carried with that cavalry blanket to an Episcopal church where the smell of evergreens was still there because it was shortly after Christmas. And for most of his life, when Christmas time came, we would call it a panic attack. He would break out in sweat at the smell of a Christmas tree because as a toddler, he was carried with those who had survived into the Episcopal church. My grandmother was Tlingit. I enjoyed, as I listened to the words, my spirit responded of our brothers and sisters that we heard as they were speaking. And my grandmother, like one of the speakers, was as a child taken to Carlisle Indian School, as was my grandfather taken to Carlisle Indian School. And when she was 14 and they were married and ran away and hidden back among my grandfather's people, my grandmother kept the blanket. My grandfather could not belong to her people, could not belong to the Killer Whale clan or any of those because he was not of her people. So she made him a coat as they were older. And from the blanket in which he had been picked up, she sewed the pieces together and made a coat. And her name meant the way icicles look when they're lit by the moon, or the moon of the silver fox. And so he could wear her. She put on the coat the moon of the silver fox that he could wear with her. She took elk skin and trimmed it in the style that was for his people. She trimmed it in seashell buttons as a representative of her people. And on the back, because he could not wear the killer whale of her people, she began to do beadwork, and my great uncle continued it, of a baby killer whale within a circle. Not the depiction of her people, but of the beginnings of their life together. And each of us, you and me together, when we come in our daily lives, we wear our histories upon ourselves, our work of faith and our work of grace, and we step out into the world. But whether they are things that are unusual, whether they are things that are ceremonial, we wear the history of our people and the history of ourselves into the presence of other people. And the greatest work that we do as the church is to acknowledge the history of each other, not just the history of our peoples, but the history of our lives and the work of God through grace in our lives. And as we encounter one another, we say in a traditional setting, "Oh God, Let the people I encounter touch my life so that when I leave here, I am a different person from having been in their presence. And we ask God, oh God, do the work of the Spirit within my life till I am changed not just by myself or not just by the things that I learn and that I read, but that I am changed by my encounter with the people of God, no matter who they are and where they come from. It is not unusual. Sometimes in talking to people will come and they'll say, I'm so sorry what happened to your people. And it's always a difficult moment to know what exactly to say. But sometimes there are those moments when people will say something as if, I am very sorry for what happened to Native people, but I'm tired of hearing about African American people. But your cause I can identify with. Your history I can pick up, but I don't want to hear this history anymore. And within our spirit, something must turn over. Something within ourselves must enable us to say, whatever is done to God's people in the world, not only in the past, but in this moment and in this day, is done to me. Whatever is done in the world to anyone is done to me as if it were done to the person of Christ. And our spiritual natures must leap up and say, we are living examples of the grace of God that enable us to be changed by the persons whom God puts us into relationship with. I love this passage from Jeremiah. Not my favorite book of the Bible. I'm sorry, Joshua. I'm selective sometimes in fundamentalism. I like some things and I don't, so I choose. And in this passage of Joshua is this immediate story which steps up and grabs us and teaches us something. Here's Joshua before the eve of a battle. And the angel of God comes and stands in front of him. And Joshua's response is, are you for us or are you for them? And I really like the way the King James sums it up. When he asks the question, are you for us or are you for them? The angel says, no. No. I am here as captain of the Lord's host. Not all that is spiritual is about us or them. We are people of God. And when we stand in God's presence, we do not ask, are you for me or are you for them? We are here as people of God, responding to the voice of God. And God says, no. No. Take off your shoes. This isn't about the battle, you see. It's not about the battle. It's about preparing yourself for the presence of God. Take off your shoes. For where you're standing at this moment, when God engages you in encounter with somebody else, is holy ground. It is holy. It is not whether they sing songs or play drums. It is when you are engaging with someone to whom God asks you to be in relationship, no matter who that person is, you would symbolically take off your shoes because you are in the presence of God. I used to ask my father, can a person be a Christian and be prejudiced? And my dad said yes. A lot of people come to God wearing the history upon themselves. But what changes us is that when God asks us to get up from where we are and love another, then our choice is not between our prejudice and our action. Our choice is between obeying the God we serve and recognizing the holy. And the moment we stand up and take our shoes off and say, no, this is not about me or them, it is about God. We stand on holy ground. The moment we decide, I cannot or I will not love, we do not choose to hold our prejudice, but we choose to step away from God and what God asks us to do. And God always brings us back to that question. Will you get up from where you are and love the person that you think is unlovable? In the history of our church among Native people, as we talk about our history, sometimes we say it is not our history. But for Native people, anything that is associated with the name of Christ or indigenous people around the world, when you say the word church, it means all of us. When you say the word church and the atrocities of the church, people associate that with the person of Jesus Christ. In Alaska, we say often, because we don't have mental health providers among our children, we have one mental health provider for every 100,000 Native children. But we can put biofeedback devices on our children or people in villages as we ask questions. And when we say the word missionaries, we get a deep physical response from people. When we say the word missionaries, it brings up a sense of physical, psychological trauma in the people's lives. We talk about Sand Creek and we try to couch the language, and Sand Creek is so much a part of the history of Oklahoma and the Cheyenne Arapaho people who are here. I was listening to the wonderful video where we described dozens of people who were killed. In reality, it's hundreds of people who were killed. The soldiers, many of whom were Methodist members. John Chivington, a Methodist district superintendent in the past. John Evans, from whom Evansville, Indiana, and Illinois are named after. And on the day of that battle, the soldiers came into the village where they were, and they didn't just dismember some, they dismembered many. They took the uterus of women and wore them as hatbands. They cut off people's breasts, mutilated men, and they rode through the streets of Denver with body parts on their hats and on their saddles. And across an amphitheater inside of Denver, there was a wire that ran across where those body parts hung for 2 weeks, and people could come by and look at them. The legacy of Sand Creek is not just the mutilation of those people who were Cheyenne and Arapaho, but it began among our history, the violence of abuse of Native women. From that point on in the history of the West, we look at the history of violent battles against Native people, and half of them clearly involved the mutilation of our mothers and sisters and wives. Today, the highest rate in the world of abuse is against women who are indigenous. In our country, it's against Native women. The highest rate of suicide in the world are boys, Native boys, 13 to 18. We look at in Alaska, where I live, and the highest rate of abuse, it has the highest rate of abuse against women in the country, and the highest rate of abuse is against Native women by non-Native men. When we walk to Native events, we escort our women with us. When we gather for the Alaskan Federation of Natives, we walk our grandmothers and our wives and our sisters and our friends down to the hotels. We need to say today that in our country, in many parts of the country, it is deemed permissible to abuse a Native woman or a child. I sat in a trial recently of a priest who had abused over 300 children across Canada, and his response was, "I don't see what the problem is. They're Native people. I don't see what the problem is. They're Native people." The ability to see that people are disposable still exists. Until the 1970s in our country, Native children could be removed from their homes without the knowledge or consent of their parents. A social worker could walk up to a family's home and take children who were playing in the yard. Until the Indian Child Welfare Act, children could be removed and adopted out, and church organizations could adopt them on either side of Canada and the United States and destroy their birth records. So children would never be able to go home or know who their families were. The children who were adopted are millions. They are millions from Canada and the United States back across borders. And when we look at the history, it was Christian organizations which did that. In the 1970s, it was still permissible for people who were involved in church agencies or missionaries to simply point to a person and say, that person is a traditional spiritual leader. Did you know that in the United States there was a place called the Canton Indian Insane Asylum? And they would take people simply on the basis that many times missionaries of denominations would say, that person is still practicing traditional beliefs, and that was outlawed in our country. Not only was it illegal to teach Native children in their languages, if you were a school teacher, you could not teach Native children within their own languages. It was against the law. Native children taught in government schools were not taught Native languages. There, when children could be removed and the language was removed, it was in the early 90s with the Religious Freedom Act that Native people regained the right to practice their religion. People could simply point a finger and say, this person needs to be removed from this community because they're a traditional person. There is not an adult Native person within this meeting today who has not known people who were sexually abused, forcibly removed, or taken away from their communities because of their traditional religious beliefs. When the government closed Canton Indian Insane Asylum, there they would put traditional leaders saying he or she is practicing, they must be insane because they can't come back to what we are offering them, and they would be put in the insane asylum. Children who were homosexual within our communities that had a part of our lives, those children were taken and imprisoned or put in insane asylums. People with birth defects or people who were blind within our communities who were part of our lives and part of the people that we loved and we made way for were institutionalized. So when we hear the word missionary, within our heart begins to beat, and our bodies sometimes begin to sweat. Because when we think about the Christ of the church, we associate it with the people who took our children. When they closed the Canton Indian Insane Asylum, Congress reviewed that there were less than 4% of people ever sent there with any form of mental illness. And when you visit the site of what used to be it, they were hasty in destroying the building, there is a large mound on a golf course which people play around. And in that mound are the remains of those who died at Canton Indian Insane Asylum. There is a grace of God. There is a grace of God that reaches to us. This is not about us or them. It's about the sacredness of God. Standing in the presence of God who says, even before an enormous, ununderstandable conflict, take off your shoes, you are on holy ground. My grandmother practiced what she called instant forgiveness. I'm not that good at it. What she meant by that was that when someone did something wrong to her, that immediately she began praying that God would enable her to forgive. Immediately when something happened, my grandmother believed that you began praying for healing and touching. We talk about what has happened to Native people. We can play that through the history of the world and see it continuing today in parts of the world with enslavement. When we talk about children in boarding schools, we talk about Australia and we talk about the Soviet Union. We talk about Korea, where their names were changed and their hair was cut. We talk about the Philippines, where the Methodist Church also came in with comity agreements, and folks who were Roman Catholic suddenly became Methodists. We talk about it all over the world, and what we have done to one another, we will do to others around us. And I like what Stephen says and Jesus says on the cross. Don't lay this sin against their charge. I have the capacity, I believe, and I'm stretching the theology, and those from you from St. Paul's can talk to me about it later. I believe that I have the capacity in the presence of God to say to those who have harmed me, to those who have hurt my family, and you have that capacity as well. Oh God, in the presence of their spiritual life, don't let this be the thing which impedes them in your presence. Oh God, through the generations of this, don't let this be the thing that impedes our progress together. Oh God, for those who would hurt, those who took my father from his home, for all of those people, God, let me be the one who begins in the process of this to say, God, let me live in such a manner that I can bring healing to my people or open the doors to bring healing to people. And oh God, change my life by encounters with those many times who would set out to harm. I was a little boy. I went to my grandmother's house, stayed with my grandparents often. My grandmother liked to touch trees. She would walk along and she would reach out her hand and she would pat a tree or a rock. My grandmother was Tlingit, but she lived with my grandfather's people. We were coming back our way from delivering food to the old folks. My grandmother delivered food to the old folks up until she was 97. And she would always take a little Tupperware container to church, because when they had potluck at the end of it, then they would give food to the elders. And so she always had lard cans and Tupperware when they came out, and she would take that food and visit with people. We were coming back, and we stopped at a grove of trees, and 3 young Anglo men stepped out from behind the trees. And they were laughing at my grandmother, and they struck her, and she fell down. She went to stand up, and they hit her again, and then I stood up, and they hit me across the mouth. My grandmother was wearing winter moccasins because she loved the feel on her feet. They took her moccasins, they took my shoes, and they took both of our coats. We walked home 2 miles in the snow of October back to my grandmother's place. And when we got to her home, my grandmother went to the sink and she pumped a bucket full of water, a basin full of water. She washed the blood from her face, filled the basin full of water, and washed the blood from mine. And then she unbraided her hair, and her hair fell way down below her knees, and she stood at the sink. She filled a basin full of water. She took her hands and she dipped it all over her face and on the back of her hair and down her back. She patted her dress, she patted her knees, and she stood for a while and she prayed. And then she emptied the basin. The spiritual significance of that is important. She emptied the basin and filled it with fresh, clean water and laid it there in the sink and invited me to come. And I imitated her, not really understanding what it was all about at the moment, but I patted my hair and I patted my shirt and I patted my pants, and my grandmother emptied the water out and wiped the basin, put it back under the little sink, and went about the duties of the day. Over the months, she bought beads, and that the beadwork that she did at that time of her life was tiny and intricate, and she beaded 3 pairs of moccasins. She beaded the top, that was beautiful, covering the top and the flaps and the back. And then she turned them over, and on the bottom, through the rawhide sole, my grandmother beaded the soles of moccasins, which is what you did within that culture for a sacred ceremony where somebody would wear the moccasins only once because it was so sacred. And she wrapped them in butcher paper, and she put them up on the shelf. Christmas Eve came, and my grandmother went to the sink and she unbraided her Norwegian braid, she called it, and her hair hung down, and she washed her face and she patted her hair and she patted her shoulders and patted her dress. She was setting herself apart to live a sacred act in an unsacred world. And she braided her hair and invited me, and I went to the sink and I patted my hair like my grandmother, and my shirt and my pants, and I stood there at the sink. And then we walked out into the snow and we went down. And there were the grove of trees, and each tree who had been there when my grandmother was kicked, she went to the tree as if a silent witness, and she patted the tree. And we went down over the edge of a hill, and I knew where we were going. And I said, "Grandmother, why are we going here?" She took my hand and we went down to the door, and my grandmother knocked on the door, and a man with a large red beard opened the door. Here was my grandmother, who was about 4'10" at her tallest, looking up at a large man in the doorway. She said simply, "I have some gifts. May I give them?" He didn't move, so my grandmother put her hand on his chest. She faced the spiritual obstacle and put her hand on his chest and gently stepped around him. But the hand on the chest is what one does to a loved one that says, "Listen with your heart. Listen with your heart." and she stepped around him and walked into the room, and there were 3 young men sitting there. And to each one, my grandmother handed a paper packet wrapped in brown paper, and to each one she said, "Merry Christmas, God bless you." And they opened the moccasins, and the moccasins caught the light of the room, and there was almost an attitude of disgust. But they stood there holding the moccasins. And we walked past the man with the red beard. We climbed to the hill, and to each tree my grandmother patted it as if to say, "It's all right, we've done the sacred thing. We are here to do the work of God. This is not us or them. Take off your shoes." Sometimes people take off your shoes metaphorically. They take the things of your culture metaphorically. They destroy the things that are part of your spiritual identity, and they steal those very things from your life. And there, shoeless, you discover the voice of God that says, "No, not for us or them. Take off your shoes and stand in holy ground." And I am reminded so many times that as an old woman and a little boy walked back the 2 miles to her house, somewhere in the house of those young men who we would never see again was the presence of God, saying, "Take what you stole, what you took on attention, and take it as a gift. Take it as a gift." There is, in conclusion, the Tlingit poem that goes like this. A long time ago, when the world was new, all creation had its own song, except for the wind and except for the tree who had no voice of their own. The wind would blow over mountains and stones, but the sound was lonely and cold. And the wind cried at night, but no voice was heard in the legends our grandmothers told. But the tree which stood on the mountain said, "I'll be the voice for the wind, for I know its touch. It planted my seed. I'll sing the wind song for him." So the winter wind blew through the trees' empty limbs, and the voice of the wind was heard. And the summer wind danced with the leaves of the tree, and they fluttered its love to the world. Abba, Father of all, looks inside everyone, crying, "Come, children, who'll sing for me? For you know my touch. What lovelier song than the sound of the voice of the free? Blow, spirit wind, through the leaves of our lives, through dry bones where warriors will stand. Speak, spirit wind, through these vessels of clay, your love song for God and these ones." God bless you.